Alright, next I want to go over the basics of the clip view. And also I want to distinguish the clip view from loading audio into Simpler because they're two very different things in terms of functionality. So taking a look at the audio clip that we recorded in the last video, you can see that we have a waveform view down here in the basic clip. Additionally, we have a variety of controls over here which I want to go into in a little more detail because this is important stuff for sample-based music production. First, looking at the waveform window itself here, we have both a start and an end flag, very similarly to what we saw in the Simpler device. Additionally, we have some numbers going across with little flags under them. These are called warp markers, and essentially what they allow you to do is stretch and compress audio in a lot of different ways using Ableton Live's warping engine over here. We'll take a look at that in a second. The distance between two of these whole numbers here, such as between 4 and 5, represents 1 bar of music. The length of a bar down here is based upon the project's tempo up here. So right here we have 1 bar of musical information at 120 beats per minute. Now of course that may or may not actually match up with the beats per minute of the track that you sampled, but we'll figure out how to determine that in a second. So say you want to chop out part of this break that you've sampled, and that means you're going to want to go back through the audio that you've sampled and find a nice starting point for a break. All you have to do is grab your start marker right here and start playing back the audio while dragging the marker around and finding a suitable place to start. So I'm going to hit play up here. Now I'm combining this with hitting the space bar to play and stop the audio. So every time I move this number 1 marker right here, all I do is hit the space bar and it starts playing audio at the new position that I've moved the first warp marker to. So that's roughly where I want my break to start. And I think for these demonstration purposes, I'll sample about 4 bars of music. Now what I'm going to do is play the audio back and count to myself 4 bars. And then when I see where the 4th bar ends, right here in the waveform, I'll make further adjustments. The next thing I'm going to do is bring my end flag right over here to the 5th bar. Again, because we want to play from 1 to 5, that is 4 bars of information. So I'm going to double click on this number 5 right here, and I'll adjust it right about to where the 4th bar ends. Now we're at the point where we want to make some more specific adjustments to our looping settings. So just like we did with the Simpler window when we were looking at the waveform, you can zoom in on the waveform here in the clip view. And again, that's as simple as hovering over the waveform, waiting until it turns into a magnifying glass, and then just dragging down while you click. And as you can see, zooming in gives us far more information about where the music starts and ends. I think I want this breakbeat to start on the snare drum, and you can see the snare drum pretty prominently down there in the right channel. So I'm going to zoom in even more and try to get this number 1 right on the start of the snare drum. That sounds pretty good. So that'll be the exact beginning of our breakbeat. Next I'll zoom in to the end of our loop here and try to find the ending. So probably right about here. That sounds pretty good. So now we have 4 bars of music looped up pretty well here. Now a nice side product of the way we've done things here is that we can come over here and look at the BPM of the clip itself. And as you can see, since we knew that we had 4 bars of information and we looped it up properly between 1 and 5, we now have the clip's BPM displayed over here. And as you can see, the BPM of the track itself and the BPM of the project are very similar to one another, so it wasn't very hard to loop this up. If the BPM of the track that I sampled had been radically different than this, say somewhere up in the 130s or 140s, we would have had to do some more extreme adjustments, but you still would have had an easy time looping it up properly because of the technique I've shown you here. Let me just recap that once more so we understand where we're at. Once you've sampled your audio, determine how many bars of music you'd like to keep as your breakbeat. Once you've determined that, find a good start point, and then count back to yourself the number of beats that you want to keep. If you know how many bars you've sampled, then simply take that many bars of warp markers and surround the audio that you want to keep. Just as long as the number of bars here in the warp markers match up with the actual number of bars in the music that you've sampled, you'll be fine. So now that we've got one of the breakbeats that we want to keep, I want to create a copy of this clip, again holding down Option or Alt, depending if you're on a Mac or a PC, dragging down here. And now I'm going to double click on that copy and work with it for a bit. Now in this new clip, I'll just call it Break 1. Again, renaming is as simple as selecting what you want to rename and hitting Command or Control R. I'll call this one Break 1. Since this new clip is just supposed to have one breakbeat in it, we don't need all of this other musical information that is surrounding the loop. So it's best just to go in and crop this sample so that it keeps only the audio that you want. And that's as simple as right-clicking right here in the clip view and going to Crop Sample. And there you go, it throws away all the useless information and just keeps the loop that you want to work with. Let's move back up to our original recording here and loop up just one more break that we can use. I remember a nice melodic part coming in over here towards the end of the recording. So let's take a look at that. I'll just double click and deactivate all of the warp markers that I don't need, and then just drag my number 1 marker around again like we were before. I like that part right there, so let's loop it up. I think I want the breakbeat just to start right here on that string part that comes in very abruptly. Now I'll just count out the beats like I did with the other breakbeat. Okay, I just want 2 bars of that. So I'll loop it between 1 and 3. Double click on 3, zoom in and try to get some lined up loop settings here. And I'll adjust it a little bit here. And that sounds pretty good. So I'll make another copy of that and drag it down here. And I'll select it and rename it to String. I'll delete the original sample that we had up here because I don't feel like I need it anymore. And we'll just work with these 2 audio files. Now that we've chopped a couple of breaks, let's take a look at some of the parameters in the clip view. Probably the most important part about the clip view is the warp settings. You can turn warp on and off right here, and as you can see, when you turn it off, all the warp markers disappear. Now what the warp engine allows you to do is to bend and stretch audio in a way that allows you to change the BPM and the tuning separately from one another. In traditional sampling devices, if you change the tuning, you would change the BPM, and vice versa. But with this technology, Ableton has allowed us to decouple those 2 parameters from one another in some pretty extreme ways. Now there are a variety of algorithms that the warp engine uses depending upon the nature of the musical material that you're sampling. Right now it's set to beats, and that's the default position. As you would expect, the beats algorithm is best for heavily rhythmic material, and that's what we have here. Even the melodic material in this breakbeat is very rhythmic in nature, so the beats algorithm is probably best. But we have a variety of other algorithms as well, such as tones, which is good for tonal instruments, texture, which is good for glitches and pads and abstract things like that, repitch, which is a basic DJ style repitching tool. We won't go into it in this series. And then complex, which you use when you have a clip that has a lot more musical information in it than just tones or just beats. So complex is used when you have the full band playing in the clip that you've sampled. I almost always use the beats setting, occasionally the tones or texture settings if I'm doing some glitchy stuff. I rarely ever go to the complex setting unless it really sounds better than the other algorithms. Moving over here, we have some tuning parameters. You have transpose and detune, which work with one another. Transpose adjusts the tuning within semitones, and then detune adjusts it within cents. There are 100 cents per semitone, and there are 12 semitones per octave on a keyboard. Therefore, you can tune just about any loop or stab or whatever sample that you're working with very precisely. Now remember what I said before about how the warp engine allows you to retune a sample without changing its BPM, and vice versa. Listen to what I mean. So as you can see, you can retune it in some pretty extreme ways. And the quality of the audio degradation as you tune it to more extreme settings will be very apparent. And it will also vary depending on what warp algorithm you're using. So all of these parameters are extremely interdependent and best learned through practical use. As you use these over and over again, you'll come to have some favorite warp algorithms depending on what kind of material you tend to write, as well as algorithms that you just tend to stay away from because they don't work for what you do. Also realize that you can turn looping on and off over here. If you noticed, my loop only played through once and then stopped because I didn't have looping turned on. As you can see, you have some helpful information down here about the nature of your loop, where it starts to play back, and how long it is. As you can see, I have a 4-bar long loop, both from looking at the waveform view here, as well as just viewing these numbers over here. So this is really two different places you can go for the same information, depending on what you're doing. Up here we have a few helpful buttons for some common operations that you want to carry out on audio. REV stands for reverse, and as you could probably expect, it reverses the audio. So if I hit that and then play it back, you can hear that it has the expected effect. I'll go ahead and re-reverse it so it plays back the right way again. Save saves all the clip settings with your original sample. Remember, again, we're dealing with an audio clip here, and an audio clip is not the same thing as an audio file. Rather, an audio clip includes an audio file as well as a bunch of warping information over here, such as what warp mode it's using and where the warp markers are set up. If you drag any of your samples into Ableton Live and then set up warping on them, and then you later go back and look in the directory from which that sample came, you'll see that Ableton Live has created a new file along with your audio sample that saves all of these different settings. And that's really handy when you want to go back and change these things up in a non-destructive manner. High Q simply means high quality playback. I almost never activate that button because it rarely makes a difference for most samples. However, once in a while, some samples will sound a little bit better with the high quality button enabled. Of course, the trade-off here is that more of your processor cycles will be used playing back a higher quality sample. The Edit button is interesting because it can allow you to bring up a third-party sample editing software. If you want to set what software is opened when you hit the Edit button here in Ableton Live, simply go back to that Preferences window that I showed you before, and you can set it up there. Last, I want to talk about the RAM button. Now, what the RAM button does in itself is not very exciting. It simply loads your sound into RAM. Now, the reason why this is important in a broader sense is because of how Ableton Live works generally. Ableton Live, by default, streams audio off of your hard drive in real time. The reason that's significant is because of how it's distinguished from a hardware device workflow such as the MPC 2000 or the MV 8000. Those devices are unable to stream audio directly off the hard drive. Instead, they rely on streaming audio from their RAM. What this means in a practical sense is that you're extremely limited in the amount of audio you can have loaded up at one time in one of those devices. Those limitations are all but eliminated when you're working with software like Ableton Live, because now the hard drive size in your computer has replaced the small RAM size in one of those hardware devices. So if I have a 320 gigabyte hard drive, I'm not going to have to worry too much about how much audio I'm actually loading up in a live set, because the audio will simply be streamed directly from the hard drive whenever I want to play an audio file in Ableton Live. The RAM button right here simply allows you to load your sound into RAM if you ever want to do so. Never in the entire time that I've used Ableton Live since version 1 have I ever had to load a sound into RAM, and I honestly can't see a situation where I'd ever need to. So the button itself isn't very important, but I do think it's very important that you realize that Ableton Live has the ability to load up and play far more audio than you could with one of those hardware devices. This is an important fact if you're trying to transfer your workflow from a hardware device to Ableton Live, because now you'll be able to load up far more sound at once and play around with many more ideas without having to run out of storage space. Let's take a look at the last few clip parameters over here. You have the name. You can of course rename it right here. You can assign a different color to the clip, which can be handy. Sometimes you might want to assign all of your drum type clips to one color and then all of your vocals to another color. And when you start filling up the live interface with many different clips of information, that can be pretty handy in order to avoid confusion. Here you can set the time signature of the clip. We won't go into that too much for this mini-series. And then here we have the groove section. Groove simply allows you to add swing to a clip that didn't originally have any swing. For instance, if I wanted to swing on eighth notes, I would simply choose swing 8 and then play the clip back. And while I play it back, I'm going to increase the groove parameter up here in the upper left-hand corner. If you leave that on 0, the clip will play back as normal, as if you hadn't chosen a groove. So make sure to change this parameter up here whenever you want some groove applied. And as you heard, while I increased that parameter, more and more swing was applied to the clip. Another thing you might have heard was the quality of the audio degrading. And again, that's because the more you process audio in extreme ways, the harder Ableton Live will have to work to make your audio sound good. Therefore, it's generally best to process your audio as little as humanly possible in order to retain the quality of the original loop. That's all there is for the basic settings of the clip view. In the next video, I want to take you through the clip envelope view, a very important feature of Ableton Live, especially for the sample-based producer.